In this video, I want to show you how to take some data, and remember we crunched this data in the last video, and we want to take that data and we want to graph it. And in this case, we're going to create a bar graph or a column graph, as Excel likes to call it. So let's have a look at how we do that. The first thing is, since we've got a lot of data here, we don't want to graph each individual student's data point. We want to calculate the averages. So I'm just going to highlight those two averages. And then I'm going to go to Insert, and then I'm going to go here to Charts. And I can see where I have the bar graph, or again what they call the column chart, or I can just go on Recommended Charts, and it's giving me some options that I can look at them and say, yeah, that's the one I want. I don't want that one. That's what they call a bar chart in Excel, but they call the column chart the one that's vertical columns. So I'm going to click on that, and I'll hit OK. And there's my chart. And the first thing you may notice about it is it looks, well, first off, nothing's labeled. We're going to have to label it. But the thing that really strikes me first is that it really looks like middle school students check social media a lot more than upper school students and high school students, right? And when you look at 8.3, 7.9, that's not a big difference, right? 7.7 to 8.3, that's pretty small. So what I want to do is I want to go over here to my axis, and I want to kind of relabel that. And if I go to Axis Options, so I went over, when I clicked on that, this little menu popped up, and I went over to the graph and Axis Options, and notice it's saying my minimum is 7.7 and my maximum is 8.3, because it's saying, well, really, we only care about those two values, so we don't need to have lower values or greater values. Well, I don't like that. Let's get rid of that. And let's go to 0. Okay, and 8.3, let's just go to 9. Okay, this looks a little better, right? This looks like really there's a little difference, but it's not a big difference, especially when we put in our standard deviation, which is going to show the spread in our data, right? And we can see there's a lot of variation in our data. So this is going to be a better way to show the data. Okay, the second thing I don't like about my graph here is I've got 1 and 2, and I don't really know which is which. Okay, so notice up here there's a tab called Design. When you're going to be doing things and labeling your graph, you always want to be in this Design tab. Okay, and in the Design tab there is a Select Data, and I can click on that. And over here it said, oh, these are what the data you wanted. Okay, that's fine. But then the horizontal category axis labels, it's just labeled them 1 and 2 because I didn't really tell them what these two things were, right? But what I can do is I can edit that. And since I put the labels up here, I could type them in with a semicolon in between, or I could just highlight the two of them and said OK. And Excel knows that since this one is on this column and this one is on this column, that it must be middle school and upper school. So it did that automatically for me. Okay, so now I can see my two columns. I've got them labeled, which is good. Okay, I've got a chart title, right? And I want to give it a title. Well, I already have a title up here too. So why don't I just go up and copy this and see if I can paste it in there. Ooh, there we go, a number of times. So now I know what I'm looking at here, okay? And notice I don't have any indication of what these numbers are either, right? So I can go over again. Notice when I'm in my data table, I'm back on my sort of more Excel format, but if I click on my graph and then go to Design, when I'm in the Design tab, I can go to Add Chart Element, and this is where I can add a lot of stuff to my graph, right? So I can go to Axis Titles, and my primary vertical, I can say, what is that? Well, that's going to be number of times social media checked. Okay, and I can kind of move that if it's too close. I can kind of move that around. I can move this around. I can adjust this as needed. For my horizontal axis, I can label that too, or since both my bars are labeled, probably don't need to, but let's go ahead and do that anyway. So I have up here axis titles, primary horizontal, and we'll just say type of student. Okay, so and notice it didn't do anything until I hit enter, and then it pops in down here, but I can see what I'm typing up here when I'm typing that in. Okay, now the last thing I want to do, since I made you guys in the last video calculate the standard deviation, well, that's kind of useful because that shows us how much spread there is in the data. In other words, are all of our points, are all middle school students right around 8 and just a little over 8, and are all upper school students just below 8? It's kind of important to kind of help illustrate the spread in the data, since we're not doing a histogram here, we're just doing two averages, to put in error bars. And an error bar in this case is going to show the standard deviation, in other words, plus or minus, where the range of the error bar is going to show where 2/3 of the student's data would fall. And that's going to be a good indication of the spread. If it's really spread out, my error bar is going to be really long. If it's very narrow and I have a very kind of all my points close to the average, then I'll have very small error bars. Okay, so again, making sure I'm in the design tab, going over to add chart element, which is going to have, again, a lot of the things I need to do. I'm going to go to error bars, okay, and now it's got, standard deviation, but notice that standard deviation is a default. It is not the actual standard deviation that we've already calculated, right? So I can't use that. It looks like I could, but that is actually not the value I want. But we want more error bar options, and we hit on that. Notice over here we have some things about the kinds of lines I want, the colors, the fonts, and all that, but I need to click on the graph again, the error bar options over here, and I want these two bars on the top and bottom of my error bar. I want both up and down. I don't want a fixed. That's what it was giving me before. It's just giving me a fixed value. I want a customized value, and that specific value is going to be plus these two values, 3.2 and 2.7, and minus 3.2 and 2.7. So the default in here, 1, I don't know why it gives me a default of 1. Sorry about the dog. I'm going to erase that completely, and then I'm just going to highlight these two values. And then again, it knows which goes with which because it can kind of figure that out based on the columns. Okay? And then my negative value is the same. It's going to be minus those two values. So plus those two values, and then minus those two values. Make sure you get rid of that 1. Sometimes it'll want to add that 1 to these data points, and that's not what you want. You just want plus 3.2 and minus 3.2 for the middle school, and plus 2.7 and minus 2.7 for the upper school. And what these values mean is that there's a little bit more fluctuation or range in my middle school students' data than in my upper school students' data, right? So anyway, I've got those in there, again, right off of there, and I hit OK. And now notice what it did. It said, the error bars would have gone above the top of my graph. So it's changed it to 13. So it's now going from 1 to 13. But I can still see these two average values or mean values are very close. And I can see I've got a pretty big standard deviation. In other words, 2/3 of my data for upper school students falls in this range. 2/3 of my middle school falls in this range. So that first graph I put on here, looks like there's a huge difference in middle school students and upper school students and how much they check social media. But when I scale it properly and I include my standard deviation from those two data sets, I can see it's really not a significant difference, right? I can say that they both are around 8 times a day on average, but that there is significant variation in the data for all the students, which you can sort of see over here when you're just eyeballing the data. So I've got a nice looking graph. I've got my two columns labeled. I've got my X and Y values, X and Y axes labeled. I've got a title on here. So I can now copy and paste this right into my lab, and I've got a really nice looking graph. Okay, that's it, and thank you.